So at that point, I will open up the floor to questions online or here. If you want to start. Hold on, I just need to wait for the microphone. And again, I invite everyone to ask Dr. Seema a question, but everybody a question, but we do lose Dr. Seema in about 15 minutes. So.
Okay. Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. I'm concerned about what's going to happen to the civil society organizations. I mean, myself, I came across an Afghan who was in London who's gone back to Afghanistan, and she said she was having so much problem finding funding. A few years ago, it would have been so easy. Fortunately, I was able to introduce her to an EU embassy, and I think something is going on. But she said so much, and the person I'm talking about is a well-known figure in Afghan society. And if it's so difficult for someone who's well-known to get funding, how is it going to be for ordinary women and men who are running these civil society organizations? And whichever way we see it, the aid is being reduced now. Organizations are noticing that USA and DFID are reducing their funding levels and are cutting off funding completely. And this is a situation, who is going to replace these organizations? And we've got a situation with the vacuum, people like the narco traffickers are going to move in and are going to become the major employers again. And this is going to leave Afghanistan in a terrible situation which no one is taking responsibility for at the moment.
And so, Dr. Seema, I'll give it over to you. I mean, is that a problem? Is there an increasing inability to get to civil societies, to support civil society, and how is civil society reacting right now?
Well, I think I agree with him, because a lot of money came in this country, and a lot of them are spent in Afghanistan, but not necessarily in the right direction. One is the lack of enough support for civil society, I have to say, because I think civil society is the important part of the democratic society. If we are talking about democracy in Afghanistan and building democracy in Afghanistan, so that is really, particularly women's group, and are really facing on this funding problem, lack of funding for them, or getting more difficult for them in order to get funding. I just repeat the same thing, that we should not really repeat what we did in 1992 with Afghanistan. And now when the donor countries are withdrawing their soldiers, actually they really reduce on military expenses in Afghanistan. They should increase the other part of the civilian budget for Afghanistan and reconstruction of Afghanistan. And I believe that without the proactive civil society, or lively civil society within the country, we are lacking one part of democracy, or building democratic society in Afghanistan. So that is very, very important. And I will add that it's not only the civil society, but women's particularly, or women's group. They should be supported. They should get more capacity building program for them. It's quite difficult. If you look at the possibility of women's access to universities, it's really not very fair, because we still don't have enough women who are capable to train teacher to go to Paktika, for example, or to go to Paktia in order to keep the girls' schools running. So those are the issues that we could do if we do have a long-term, multi-dimensional strategy, I could say.
And Ashley, quickly, do you see the same problem? Do you see it getting worse or better? And do you see a long-term, multi-dimensional strategy at all?
No, I don't see any evidence of a long-term, multi-dimensional strategy. Would challenge your earlier premise that actually these Western military powers are even thinking about a political process. There is no political process. In terms of civil society, I think, as the man who asked the question, as Dr. Samar pointed out, this is a critical element. These are the best and the brightest, and they will start leaving if they do not find positions and support and a way to meaningfully contribute to their country. And if you lose that, you lose some of the people who to really rebuild and continue Afghanistan in a positive way, which is what we saw when the Taliban came into power, which is what we saw during the Civil War. And many of these people have returned with their families to rebuild and to contribute to society. And the least that donors can do and that the Afghan government can do is to support them and to make sure there's a vibrant civil society, that activists play a positive role. I mean, unfortunately, we've seen female women's rights activists increasingly under threat and attack, withdrawing from the public space. It's not like it was 3 or 4 years ago where before this sort of wave of violence against them started. And it's really, really worrying, because if they withdraw, where are women's voices? Where are Afghan women's voices?
You have another question?
Yes, it's another question for Dr. Sama.
If you could introduce yourself. Please.
Yeah. My name is Florence. I work for ActionAid, and we're just actually following on women's rights. We've just set up a parliamentary network for women's rights in Afghanistan, and I was just wondering, this is a very dynamic network of British MPs and European MPs who are really willing to do whatever they can to help to make sure that women are actually considered in these processes and discussion, wherever it's Chicago or Tokyo. I just wondered, how best do you think we can use that network? What can we ask them to do to help women being more involved in this process concretely?
Dr. Seema?
Yes, I was just waiting if you're in the picture. I don't know. Anyway, I think it's a good idea. I believe that it will help building the capacity of female MPs in Afghanistan. And I would like the British MPs to help their sisters in Afghanistan to build their capacity and to know what's their job, because some of them are really contractors. I'm sorry to say, but it's not only female, it's the more male member of the parliament. But they are also following that. I think it would be very, very good in order to have close contact with them and to build their capacity and to push them to keep their job seriously, because they have the Afghan women in the parliament. They are more than 25%, and if they stay united, they can make a lot of change, a positive change, particularly the laws friendly to women's rights in Afghanistan.
And Lucy's been scribbling furiously next to me, so I'll let her respond.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know about that initiative. It sounds very positive. But I think we also have to realize that, I mean, women have, of course, been held back somewhat by the failure of the West to support human rights in Afghanistan. And by that, I mean to support some kind of a process of accountability. And I think this was most recently indicated at Christmas time when there was a failure. I mean, I think the failure to publish the report on previous abuses over the last 30 years of conflict. And I mean, I remember when I was monitoring elections back in 2002, that the women, some of them were actually, they were actually proxies for some of the strong men. So, I think we shouldn't also be naive that there are women who are being instrumentalized in the parliament. And that we just have to be aware of that issue, and that's going to continue. But without this overall framework of transitional justice, because we have failed that completely. We did it in other interventions in the Balkans and Sierra Leone, but in Afghanistan we have utterly failed. We've just ignored this, and we've forgotten that we never did this. And I think that there is still a legacy of that, and that is the obstacle to women having full participation in politics and being able to feel that they can have open political space in which to express their views. And I think possibly it was a disappointment that the surge didn't revisit this idea of trying to sideline some of these strong men and to curb their influence. But there's also, there have been improvements, but we've also been held back in many areas, and I think we have to be aware of that.
Well, let's take a few questions from the audience, just in the interest of time. So one question here, and I believe there was one question over there afterwards.
Thank you. Howard Mullet from Care International, an NGO that's worked in Afghanistan since the 60s. My question brings us back to the humanitarian in the event title, which is to invite the panelists to sort of reflect on the possible dilemmas or tensions there are between what Stuart described in terms of the donor and the wider sort of political interest to align with the Afghan government and continue and even expedite the push to on-budget aid in line with the Kabul commitments, versus this sort of, these various scenarios around increasing insecurity, retraction of government capacity to reach into outside of provincial centres, and what are the implications of that for aid policy, looking sort of now also towards Tokyo?
Yeah, and then let's just get one more question down there.
Thank you. Matthew Willis from the Royal United Services Institute, which is a think tank. I had a question that was directed mainly at Dr. Gordon, but perhaps the other panelists would like to take a crack at it as well. You mentioned that one way of improving prospects for the future would be to try to keep undesirables out of government, to put it in that way, power brokers and warlords and the like. But given the strategy is about trying to create a strong central government, which requires the president to have the buy-in of the people with the weapons, is there any way of doing that without shifting that primary strategy around?
I'll ask Stuart just to wait for 1 minute. Dr. Seema, do you want to respond to either of those, but also the first one as well?
Yes, I think that there's no doubt that we failed on accountability and justice generally, not only on transitional justice, but we failed on those, and also we did not took the good governance and the fight against corruption in the country. So those things actually did give a lot of space to some of the people spiraling in the country in order to create more space for them, and they become contractor. So they're not only the warlords, but they are the richest people now currently because of the aid money, because they were in the countries. And as I mentioned, on the machinery, on the road construction, they're the one who has the machines because they had the money. So it's not the normal person. I think the only thing that I keep saying is that we should not repeat the same mistake as we did. For Tokyo conference, we have a lot of hope that it will be a better strategy for longer term support for Afghanistan, because I believe that the job has not been done in Afghanistan. So the job has to be complete in Afghanistan. And they should not leave the Afghan people at the hand of some warlord once again. And the repetition of 1992 would be a disaster, not only for Afghanistan, but for everybody in this planet. So I will end up, and I wish you all the very, very good days and good luck. And please do keep us in mind and wish good luck for us in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seema, and we wish everyone good luck there. And if before you go, or Ashley as well, the light just turned off, I think, in your room. It's a bit dark. So if someone could.
It's raining, so it's gotten
Oh.
quite dark, but we'll
Okay. Well, if there is a light, great. If not, we'll just use an example of a lack of development money. Stuart, you want to do you want to answer the second question?
Okay. Well, actually, if I could take both at the same time,
Sure.
because they're related, and they're both equally difficult, so it allows me to hop between the easy parts of both. I think a key point, really, in response to Howard's, is that a political settlement is what will create the space in which development can take place. But what will possibly happen with some of these scenarios that are in play at the moment is that they create not only more humanitarian need, but they also contract the humanitarian space, or at least the ease with which potential beneficiaries can be reached. The retraction of government, the rise of very localized patronage networks, will create a tremendous degree of complexity in gaining access. And I think we've seen some of this really well in, for example, the recent MSF book on humanitarian negotiations revealed, which explains some of the real challenges of opening up a space in one chapter in particular in Afghanistan. So I think those challenges, it's going to increase the political overheads on organizations to gain access. It's going to increase the amount of rent seeking that will take place, the attempt to use assistance as part of the political marketplace for some of these power brokers. So it's going to create a much more political engagement and tremendous difficulties for the humanitarian community. In terms of your question, I think that is the $26 million question at the moment. How do you keep the undesirables out of government when actually a number of undesirables are already in government? I don't think there is any simple solution to this. And you can see this really in the strategic partnership that was unveiled by Obama last month. There's an almost desperate attempt to keep a sense that the Americans are going to remain committed, that their engagement will transfer from being a largely kinetic operation to being counterterrorism plus engagement on the political and development side. So it's an attempt to sort of portray the dash for the door as a reasonable disengagement strategy and send a very clear message to the Taliban that don't simply wait for the American withdrawal. There will be a continuing American presence, and therefore there is an incentive to negotiate now. And I think that's the trick here, is to incentivize the negotiations with the Taliban. And I think the Taliban haven't quite realized the problems that are generated by the American withdrawal. A tremendous amount of support is generated for the Quetta Shura Taliban by the American presence. It creates a real sense of opposing an occupying force for many, particularly Pashtuns. And one wonders what will happen to the cohesion of the Quetta Shura Taliban once that uniting force has disappeared and some of the real factionalism may well emerge. And that brings us back to your question, which is that will generate a further contraction of humanitarian space. So I think there are incentives which the Taliban haven't realized for them to begin negotiations earlier rather than later and not simply wait for the American departure. I think the Americans have to encourage that presence, and the key to stability is also partly in making sure that we don't see a return to some of the predatory, rapacious governance structures that characterized the period in the South, particularly between 2002 and 2005. So I think it's a complex environment that requires a complex and nuanced strategy, and the risks are incredibly high.
Mm-hmm. And Ashley, I just want to open up to you on either of those questions before I go to some of the questions from online.
Yeah, maybe if I could just speak quickly to what Stuart was saying in terms of incentives for the Taliban, but also to go back to Howard's question about Tokyo and the on-budget support, and perhaps I'll address that one first, because I think while I've been here the past few weeks talking to donors about the humanitarian situation, talking about the withdrawal of troops, it's been fairly shocking to see the sort of uncertainty within donor agencies, the ones who are supposed to be planning for Tokyo, who are supposed to be putting together a strategy of what this looks like after 2014. The uncertainty, the exhaustion, the fatigue, and the desire to leave. And I think there's concern on the side of humanitarians about this on-budget support. So at the Kabul conference in 2000, I believe it was 11 or 10, donors committed to put 50% of their funding to the Afghan government. Now that definitely is not the reality. And it's absolutely vital to build Afghan institutions. That's the answer. I mean, that's the answer in every fragile context, is to make sure that state and local institutions and civil society work. Unfortunately, the Afghan government can spend, on a good day, between 18 and 20% of funding it receives from external sources. It doesn't have the absorptive capacity or the capacity to deliver in many areas, so it relies on NGOs or private service providers to fill the gaps in education or in healthcare or with programs like the National Solidarity Program. Transitioning, such a huge transition, is what they're looking at Tokyo, which 50%, that's enormous, and has enormous consequences in terms of how people access services. It's highly unrealistic donors, you hear a lot of skepticism, but they aren't willing to veer from the script and admit failure. It's a political issue. It's not about really securing commitments that will work for Afghans. And it's deeply, deeply concerning because on the one hand, we want to be able to support state institutions, but they don't have the capacity yet to deliver to the level that's going to happen, likely at Tokyo. And if you ask donors, what's the backup plan? What if there are no textbooks for schools, as happened this year for grades 6 to 12? What if healthcare stops in some of these provinces? What's the backup? There is none. And they're seeking to institute stronger conditionality along with these things so that if there is no delivery, if there are concerns about corruption, theoretically funding could then be cut. So you're looking at a lot of worrying trends, a lot of worrying sort of discussions happening around conditionality, around supports the government, and so on. And I think it's going to be, it's going to be very important over the next few months to sort of understand how these conversations are taking place and try and put forth an agenda that really is based on the needs of Afghans and what meets those needs, as well as building capacity over the long term. That right now does not seem to be what is driving the Tokyo discussion. On the issue of political talks, I think that, again, I would echo Stuart's sentiment of opening up the political space, but we don't have political talks right now. We don't have a coherent political strategy. I think the Taliban have reached out. They've reached out continually, and they do recognize the value of humanitarian service providers. They don't, they have strong influence in areas where they are not able to provide governance. I mean, so who do you look to? You look to the humanitarians, rightly or wrongly. But political talks have stalled, and now you have a pressure, which is in disarray, where there have been several summary executions and kidnappings of key members, and there's a lot of fear. And I think right now, you had an opportunity in 2009, 2010, even earlier this year to engage in talks, but it's becoming increasingly difficult and fractured on both sides.
I think that's a good point. I'm going to open it up to the audience again, but I just want to get two questions from online. First one from Zaim Al-Haq from Save the Children UK. Panel seems to concur on the likely scenarios after ISAF, after US, UK, and the Western troops withdraw. I'm wondering where the gaps lie then in sustaining commitment for international development assistance for Afghanistan. Is it a lost cause? And then Lakshmi from BBC Media Action. Has there been any dialogue with Afghan citizens to understand what they want and understand by the term good governance, especially given the strong role of non-state organizations, and we've called them various things, warlords and whatnot. So Lucy, why don't you take either of those?
Yeah, I mean, this raises several issues. I mean, Ashley was talking about conditionality, and in fact, I mean, I remember when I was in Afghanistan, particularly back in 2005, quite a lot of Afghan civil society organizations were actually asking for conditionality to be applied to aid monies because they were just not seeing the services delivered. I think, obviously it's rather too late for donors to suddenly start thinking about this. Another issue I have really is I feel that this whole, the way that aid has become instrumentalized by the military over the last decade, I think it's part of the huge problem that we're now facing, because as the military is now going to be pulling out, and it seems to be wanting to pull out fairly quickly, our donors, governments, etc., scaling down aid money, a lot of that has been tied to the PRTs. And in fact, when I used to go and sit on the PRT steering committee and the PRT working group in Kabul, one thing that I found incredibly shocking, and this is back to 2004, 2005, was that there was no civil society presence, and there was in fact like a sub-working group to the PRT working group, so we're talking 3 different levels down, and it was only on that working group that Afghan civil society were allowed to be represented, and also the international NGOs. So they have really been cut out of the debate, and now suddenly with people rushing for the exit and the kind of infrastructure collapsing, various different NATO countries pulling out, we're left with a very, very worrying scenario. And I would imagine that things could look eventually, potentially a little bit as they did pre-9/11, which was where you had a minimal aid presence. Of course, there was no international military on the ground. you did have these, what was the precursor to the National Solidarity Program there, I mean, just very, very basic and limited to urban areas. And this was the community forum projects that the UN Habitat were running at the time. But I think that, we're going to have some kind of community-based projects like this, with less money, obviously. This is the type of framework that we're going to be having to apparently deliver governance. I don't like the term delivering security or delivering governance, because it very much implies a sort of external intervention and something that's not coming upwards from the ground level up and from the people. But I would imagine that we might be left with that type of a framework to work with when the military has basically drawn down.
And Stuart, as Zaim asks, is it a lost cause in terms of sustaining commitment for international development assistance?
No, I don't think so. I think there are some interesting lessons to be learned. I think if you try to deliver short-term political effect with development assistance, you're doomed to fail. I think if you try to deliver, as ISAF has, governance in a box, you're doomed to fail. And I think the absence of a real effective strategy across the country to engage civil society has been a major problem. I think somebody laughingly said to me, and it's a tragedy, not a laughing matter, but governance in a box, they never defined what the box was. Was it a coffin? And I think that's been the real problem. But where there have been effective civil society or formal, informal tribal structures that have engaged with district and provincial government, and there have been some success stories where they've been able to hold governments to account for the most grievous forms of corruption, where government has shown an interest in delivering even quite minimal services. Then you've had the start of or the creation of a political space which has been quite positive. And I think there is a great hope that you can capitalize on those spaces rather than perhaps giving up completely. And I think Afghanistan's future is not written in stone. But if you think that it will be the fourth of those scenarios or the third of those scenarios that I painted, then that's exactly what it will become. If you dash for the door in an unseemly manner and you give up on trying to create that political space, you'll get what you most feared. But I think there's also the problem that the international community has been almost toothless in its application of conditionality in the past. I think there are tremendous difficulties when you try to apply conditionality in a place like Afghanistan. I think there are moral issues as well as practical issues of trying to apply the conditionality. But certainly in terms of governance and security sector reform, in those areas, a rigorous form of conditionality, a real attempt to re-engage on a political settlement and to produce a more coherent strategy would be advisable.
Can I just jump in there? I mean, I think on security sector reform, for example, I think it's very difficult now. There was this idea of disarming these illegal armed groups, which NATO commanders were very unwilling to engage with 5 years ago. And, I think, therefore, it's, this is kind of the scenario that we have built up, and we are now left with the consequences, although we have the luxury of being able to depart, leaving the Afghans to face their fate. I mean, just on some of the sort of semi-tribalized structures, I think we also need to recognize that there have existed certain models, such as a Matsura Teshura that I was familiar with in Jalalabad and Nangarhar, that was built up 2003, 2004, 2005, and the MRRD were quite interested in this. But unfortunately, President Karzai has blocked it. And, he is having to, he perhaps sees this as a threat to his autonomy, because he does recognize the legitimacy of these type of structures. I mean, I think foreigners have been generally too ignorant to understand the relevance of them. But we do also need to understand, that some of the internal dynamics that we're dealing with that might mitigate against building these kind of very stable consultative structures in outlying rural areas, and that again has to do with the political accord that the West shaped in Afghanistan by bringing back these warlords who Karzai is having to constantly horse trade with, just to keep them happy and to keep himself in the position that he's in.
Which sometimes he succeeds and sometimes he doesn't. I had a question here, if you just wait for the mic, and any other questions, obviously just raise your hand. Yeah. Oh no, it's fine. Yeah. And again, identify yourself, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sandrine from Médecins Sans Frontières. So I'm quite intrigued, actually, that I don't think anybody's mentioned the UN so far. What does that mean? So it'd be quite interesting to hear from all of you a little bit what you think about, how is the UN completely out of the picture? Is it peripheral to this whole discussion? Is it reinventing itself? And so on. Let
me go to Ashley on that. I mean, it's a very good point. Ashley, why haven't we mentioned UNAMA? And what do people say about UNAMA in Kabul? And so not only UN but the agencies too. I should expand it. So the $4 billion budget that UNAMA has, and I'm not sure what the agencies' budgets are, but it's probably equivalent to that. So we're talking $6 billion at least that the UN's spending in Afghanistan. What do people think?
Carefully here, but I think the UN has a huge role and continues to play a huge role in Afghanistan, but it depends what you're talking about. Are you talking about the World Food Program and some of the humanitarian agencies? Are you talking about UNAMA? Are you talking about UNDP? Are you talking about which parts of UNAMA? UNAMA Human Rights Unit has done an incredible job of really monitoring human rights abuses and advocating together with the Human Rights Commission, which Dr. Samar heads, for really advocating for greater civilian protection. They've been an incredible, voice and a team together. If you look at the UNAMA political side of things and engagement in talks and pushing for political reform now or in the past, I think what you saw was something, an organ which is only as strong as political will of member states and of parties to the conflict here, of contributing states. And I think UNAMA has not really been able to take a political lead or articulate a political agenda because of the pressure of donors, and I think it's a real shame. There is a need for political reform. We were just talking about corruption. We were talking about warlords. We were talking about disarmament. This is UNAMA's territory. This is what they should be doing, and it's a real gap. But certainly, I think the role of the UN is something that in coming years will be reevaluated and will, I can say with an absolute certainty, change dramatically because troops will leave. I mean, that will have an enormous impact on the role that the UN, both operational agencies, but also the political and human rights and other agendas are able to play. And I think to see a strong UN in Afghanistan after 2014, 2015 will be critical because there'll be an enormous vacuum. Again, the UN will be in a position of cleaning up a mess it didn't necessarily create, but I think it's really important to watch how those structures come about, what kind of investment there is in the UN in Afghanistan, because that is the only, that's the only real body that will be left.
That's very true. Lucy, do you want to take a less diplomatic response?
Yeah, I can. I think that, talking specifically about UNAMA as opposed to WFP or human rights, I think that UNAMA's problem is that it has become seen to be very much party to the conflict. It has taken sides. And particularly I think the Afghans perceive it to have taken sides in the conflict. It has not remained impartial. And I think this is going to obviously compromise it in its ability to lead the talks with the Taliban, which is a great shame. I have other thoughts on foreigners being perceived to be doing that anyway. I think there's been too much sort of high visibility of foreigners in this process. But no, UNAMA actually did buy into the strategy very much at the outset in Bonn. Lakhdar Brahimi was very much the Machiavelli there in deciding who should participate, who shouldn't, which Pashtun leaders shouldn't come. What happened with the emergency lawyer Jirga, which was, of course, a massive disappointment. in that the UN and the US ambassador both together on the eve of that meeting decided to make this Faustian bargain with the strongmen and break the rules of the Bonn Agreement and allow them to then participate and ultimately hijack that meeting and therefore the state building process. So I think that the UN is very much to blame, UNAMA particularly, and I think this is, it's a great question that you raised. This is why they have become largely sidelined, and unfortunately they've become contaminated, a contaminated brand. And I do remember speaking to one of the UNODC Afghans in Kandahar who was furious with the role of the UN back in 2005 and saying, why are they traveling around on military helicopters? And, if this is democracy and all it brings is corruption, then we don't want anything to do with this. But pre-9/11, of course, there was just the UN and a handful of NGOs. And, the situation was very, very different, that there weren't guns. You weren't allowed to travel around with guns in your vehicles, and it wasn't so militarized. But I think, again, because of the PRT situation, that the PRTs have been an abject failure and waste of money and capital investment, that the fact is we need to revisit this debate on humanitarian space to decide, do we need to spend billions of dollars delivering aid when this could be done by specialist NGOs and humanitarian organizations rather than having this buy-in with the military. And I think, that is also, again, where the UN has bought in too much with the military and is paying the price now in Afghanistan.
Just to quickly, is that true? Has the UN bought in too much with the military? Has the West bought in too much with the military? and where does UNAMA fit in?
Okay, I've probably got very little to add to Ashley's comments. Apart from the UN needs to be very careful it's not left holding the baby as the Americans, the British, and the others depart. But I think it's also a tremendously difficult relationship for them to manage with the other members, or with the members of the humanitarian community as well. Certainly, as humanitarian needs are likely to increase with the departure, what role does the UN have in terms of coordinating that humanitarian response? And I think a lot of independent, neutral and impartial agencies need to think very, very carefully about how they go about negotiating their own humanitarian space, the effort that they put in with the parties themselves, and probably a need to create some space between them and the UN system as well, which has inevitably been tainted by its role.
Question, I believe over there. Get the microphone to that gentleman there with his hand up. Maybe we'll take a couple, so we can.
Thank you. I'm Shaheen Chughtai from Oxfam. More of an observation than question, but firstly, I would just generally agree with the broad sentiments, and they've been expressed the concerns about how it's just a lot more difficult to try to rectify some of the fundamental mistakes that the West has made in Afghanistan. And I think the best time for rectifying some of those mistakes are now, long behind us. The challenge of keeping undesirables out of power that Dr. Gordon mentioned, I think that would have been a lot easier in 2002 than 2012. I think it's very easy to get very pessimistic about Afghanistan. So I just wanted to say that, I think we should recognize that transition is very complex, and it's not, the consequences of that are also not black and white. And Lucy Morgan mentioned community-based projects, for example. And in fact, it could well be that aid cuts and the potential withdrawal of INGOs in fact provide some impetus for local solutions, and for either Afghan organizations either take on more of that service delivery role or be set up where they can be set up. But I think that whereas, yes, the approach has been very militarized, there is still perhaps time for a civilian surge. And I think that, I can see, potentially light at the end of the tunnel, and that tunnel is Afghan civil society. We need to broaden that, channel more resources through it so that they can play that accountability role, that strengthening of justice mechanisms, and also taking on more of that service delivery role.
And there's a question over here. Yeah.
Victoria Metcalf from the Humanitarian Policy Group. Just thanks very much to all the panelists today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. And I was thinking more about the larger lessons to be learned from the international community's experience in Afghanistan. And I really have quite a basic question for the panelists. If you could speculate as to why you think the international community has continued to make so many fundamental mistakes in that country, given the historical engagement, particularly, for example, from the UK in that country, given the resources, the financial and human resources available in the last 10 years, why exactly have there been so many flaws in the analysis, the understanding, and the strategy pursued that you've highlighted in the course of the discussion today?
So why don't we start, we'll come to more questions, just two. I think it's probably too much to do more than that. Why don't we start in London with that last question. Why has the US, Stuart's wanting to start, why has the US and the UK and the West made so many mistakes?
I don't think it's easy to highlight any one individual factor. And I think many of them are fairly well known. They're the concentration on Iraq in 2001, the lack of political will, I think the lack of real understanding about the historical experience, and also some of the cultural challenges of a military force or foreigners generally operating in Afghanistan. But I think it's also fair to say that the structures of government, which not only were imposed on Afghanistan, but through which PRTs, civilian ministries in the West, the way they engaged and provided what I can only describe as a cookie-cutter approach to the problems of Afghanistan. Militaries forgetting any of the history of counterinsurgency work, preserving military space in opposition to humanitarian space, preserving 6-month or very, very short rotations in which they didn't understand the conflict environment, in which they privileged military over development or diplomatic responses. Development ministries that focused excessively on technical top-down state-building programs at the expense of delivery, at the expense of the kind of supply side of civil society. And I think diplomats that were particularly good at reporting back to capitals, but not particularly good at setting strategy, and yet were placed in significantly powerful positions in driving the engagement in Afghanistan. Plus, I think sort of collective amnesia over the last few years as well.
I have a feeling Lucy might have something to say about this.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Victoria, because I mean, this speaks directly to the core of my book, which Nick failed to mention when he introduced me.
Sorry.
And I mean, and just to give you the title, it's called The Afghan Solution, The Inside Story of Abdul Haq, the CIA, and How Western Hubris Lost Afghanistan. And it's my own experience, obviously, during those early years. But, you know, the fact is, the very lamentable fact is, there was, I believed, which is why I was driven to write this book, because it wasn't an easy task. But you know, first of all, we didn't listen to the Afghans. We didn't listen to those who knew Afghanistan. You know, the solution that did exist at the time was very much an internal solution. It was about having tribal, they'd been working on this for 2 years before 9/11, and it was tribal leaders and senior Taliban around the ex-king creating a new order, which fundamentally relied on a non-military approach. It was about making agreements over tea and nuts, and then raising the flag the next day. But unfortunately, the US imperative was the bombing campaign, which meant that a lot of people who Abdul Haq was engaging in within the regime, in the military strategy, the military axis of the Taliban, he was then, they kind of went off to their homes and left the more extremist elements in place. And I think that, you know, we've tried to impose this sort of Weberian nation state in line with our vision of what Afghanistan ought to be. And, but, you know, fundamentally, the idea of having a military approach rather than a more diplomatic internal thing that the Afghans could have potentially organized themselves. And now 10 years down the line, although it is much more complicated and challenging, you know, I was reading a report by Cathy Gannon over the weekend, an AP report, where she's interviewing Agacan Mutasim, who's I think currently in Turkey, who's one of the Quetta Shura. And he's talking about how, and I parallel this with Abdul Haq and what was going on before, because he's again trying to draw the West's attention to the fact that the Taliban are not homogenous, and that there are actually many moderate Taliban who are seeking a political settlement and who do want an end to this, a negotiated settlement. And saying that, you know, he was saying that the problem is that the West is not helping people like me, who's a moderate, to sideline the extremists, because the US doesn't want to be involved in these confidence-building measures, like releasing some of the guys from Guantanamo and recognizing the Taliban as a political force, a political party, and releasing, as he talked about, farmers who are still jailed in Bagram. So I think the West is kind of being its own worst enemy, you know, at the moment still, you know, 12 years, 10 years down the line, we still haven't learnt some of those lessons.
And so we'll segue to Ashley with that and remind everyone of that, of the first question. You know, can we look at this a little more optimistically? Can we say that now is the time to fix the mistakes of the past? Can transition be an impetus for local solutions? Is there or can there be a civilian surge? And can the light at the end of the tunnel be civil society, or is it a train?
I mean, I'd love for there to be still the political will, the funding, the optimism that sentiment or that hope articulates. I simply think there isn't. However, I do think it's important to recognize things that do work here, things that do go well. I think being out of Afghanistan for a few months prior to coming back just a few weeks ago, it's very hard to recognize it. I mean, you hear about Afghanistan in the news, and I hardly recognized it, and I lived there for years. There are things that work. There are things that are going well. Like Dr. Samar was talking about Kabul before, and the way it was in 2002, the way it is now. I mean, paved roads, at least in some places. You have people going to school. You have a thriving economy. It's built a lot on external investment and aid, which is driven by a war economy, but it does exist. You do have greater security in places. You do have the beginnings of state structures in some places. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, but I think it's important to be balanced, because if you look forward to the future, you need to also acknowledge what's gone well. And adding to Stuart and Lucy's points, which I think were extensive, for me, I mean, it's very hard to look back and say coulda, woulda, shoulda about Afghanistan, but I think it boils down to coherence of strategy. There was no coherent political strategy. There was a collection of warlords, and then talking a discourse of accountability and anti-corruption and building state structures. And you had a lot of back and forth. There was a light footprint in the beginning militarily for a very long time, until 2006, even later, 2008. When ISAF really expanded beyond Kabul. But no, I mean, in my time in Afghanistan, I've seen 4 or 5 ISAF generals come and go. General Allen is leaving, one of many generals leaving before his time was due to be up. And with each general comes a new military strategy. Counterinsurgency is over. That was partially Kilcullen, and then it was reborn with McChrystal, and then Petraeus took it in a different direction. And now Allen, I mean, that simply isn't a military strategy. So every 18 months, seeing a new military strategy, having an incoherent political strategy, and then not having, thirdly, a regional diplomatic strategy. Dr. Samar hinted at this before about the influence of neighbors and neighbors pursuing their interests in Afghanistan. Well, I think it's clear that the interests of neighbors are part of this instability. It's not just an Afghan problem. It's a regional problem that requires a regional approach, and required a regional approach from 2001 and 2002, and it simply hasn't materialized yet in any successful form. And finally, just touching on the issue of warlords and all these other things we've been talking about, and transitional justice. There was no transitional justice, but there was also no genuine reconciliation. So we can talk about co-option of warlords and how that was bad, and that was bad and it was destructive, but also the exclusion of political elements, or the exclusion of ex-Taliban, even when they made overtures over the years, even the more moderate elements have been rebuffed and continue to be rebuffed. So I think those are really just what I would add to the sort of excellent summaries of Lucy and Stuart.
One question here in the middle, and if there was, again, one question right next to him. Sure.
My name is Chris Heymans. I'm with a consulting firm called GHK. I'm just interested in whether the observations about the international community applies across the board. For example, the Danes, their development agencies. I'm not sure who else was there. I've not worked in Afghanistan myself. But did they, because in other parts of the world, they've sometimes stepped in with humanitarian efforts that the Americans and the British didn't do. And they also, in terms of their political agenda, seem to be far more, they place a far greater emphasis on human rights, at least in terms of the rhetoric they use. Has any of that been there, and could we expect maybe that that they could have an influence in the future beyond the US and UK's presence?
Sure. And then right next to you, actually. Yeah.
Thanks. Kate Smith from Relief International. I'd just be interested to know the panel's thoughts looking at the regional situation now and an increased focus on repatriation of Afghan refugees, particularly from Pakistan and Iran, back into Afghanistan over the next sort of 2-3 years, which will coincide with the drawdown of troops and the possible contraction of government to deliver services. What impact do you think this could have on the context in Afghanistan, particularly in the humanitarian sector?
Ashley, you want to take the second one first, and also go back to your point. Has there been a difference between perhaps European and U.S. strategies or individual country strategies in terms of the humanitarian space in Afghanistan, or is the larger point what you just said, that regardless of whether one is better than the other, they all have to be unified?
Well, I think they all have to be unified when you're dealing with 50 some odd nations, or and various regional interests. You have to have a common plan and roadmap for the reconstruction and stability of a country, which just never really materialized with sufficient buy-in here. Often, you sort of hear the debates that the U.S. is the more aggressive, the more militarized approach, while the European, I'm grossly generalizing here, European approach is much more slower, much more capacity building, much more civilian. But, regardless, we'll never know, because there are bits of one and bits of another, and it evolved over time and had no clear benchmarks or long-term objectives upon which to really measure success. And success in Afghanistan over the past 10 years has been a shifting metric, and it really is very subjective. So how do you know it works if you aren't all unified in where the country is going, and if the Afghan government and Afghan civil society aren't on the same boat? Just to deal with the second question on refugee issues, I think it's interesting to watch a lot of the attention around refugee issues now, within the past few weeks actually. There was a summit in Geneva 2 weeks ago, I believe. UNHCR convened around Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other donor governments to talk about solutions for return. And it put forth quite a controversial strategy of return for Afghans, of a number of pilot sites within Afghanistan where they were going to provide services for many, many millions of dollars and jobs in these places outside of urban centers, sometimes on the periphery of urban centers, where returnees could go back to. And I'm no sort of migration expert, and I can just tell you what I've heard, that this is incredibly controversial, and a lot of agencies are very concerned. But it's important because of its larger significance, that you do have Pakistan and Iran pushing to have these populations out. A lot of the language in the documents for this summit was around stability, and how the return of refugees would be stability for Afghanistan, that these populations would be able to integrate and bring stability, which is a concept that I think is problematic, and one I actually haven't heard of before. Usually it's the opposite, because it is a process of settling in and reintegrating. And it goes against what you're seeing, which is a marked rise in internal displacement over the past 10 to 12 months. You're seeing more conflict-displaced populations. Now it's over 500,000, according to the latest figures I've seen inside of Afghanistan. So I think this is going to become an increasingly politicized issue. I think it's going to become an increasingly important humanitarian issue as the conflict worsens, as you have greater instability and uncertainty with troops withdrawing.
Okay. In terms of the Danish role, I think it's actually very difficult to separate out the individual contributions of nation states. I think the Danes clearly played a very active role in Helmand, and out of all proportion, I think, to the size of the nation. It was a military effort and a development effort. I think what you can say about the Danes is that they do tend to be much more joined up in the way in which their military relates to their foreign ministry and their development work. So in that sense, it's a more integrated approach. But I think they were a small player in an American-dominated strategy, and the strategy itself had so many flaws that individual states couldn't pick up the pieces. In terms of the refugee question, I think it's a really interesting question. For Pakistan and Iran, it's probably one of the few areas that they have some degree of agreement over, with Iran trying to look after the interests of their co-religionists, to extend Iranian influence, particularly in the region of Herat, trying desperately to hedge against a return of a Taliban government that they very nearly fought a war with, and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia seeking to, particularly Saudi Arabia, to curb Iranian influence, and having a totally different vision of what a future Afghan state would be. So in one sense, getting them together in a room and agreeing on the smaller issues in comparison with the big issues is a good thing. I'm just not sure that returning displaced populations into the fray, where conflict brokers tend to use the small minority groups with few tribal protection mechanisms as a means of fomenting further conflict. I'm not sure that's terribly helpful at this stage.
Just a quick point on the Danes as well.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Stuart on that. Obviously, the Danes are one of sort of 50-odd nations. And you mentioned human rights, but, unfortunately, the whole strategy was set by the United States. So it was not very easy for them to start sort of trying to do human rights projects in Helmand or whatever, because there had already been this idea of essentially giving impunity and legitimacy to strong men who'd been in exile during the Taliban and had now come back to their regional fiefdoms. I think just the other thing just to note is that a lot of these NATO countries are in Afghanistan purely so that they can maintain some sort of special relationship. I mean, that's particularly why the Brits are there. It's not because of terrorism on the streets of Britain that the British are in Helmand. It is because David Cameron wants to maintain his special relationship with the United States, and to a lesser extent the Germans. That's why they were in Kunduz and Faizabad, and I would imagine also for the Danes too, particularly if they hadn't taken part in the Iraq War.
More questions from the audience? Yeah, one over there on the right side.
Hello, this is Sher Shah from Asia. And over the last few years, we have consistently seen foreign aid being used as a weapon system or a military tool. It has resulted in a contract economy, a very artificial economy in Afghanistan. And the indigenous entrepreneurs of Afghanistan had been excluded. We are seeing a new business elite, which was on the basis of the contracts, the foreign government contracts. And once the foreign government contracts would reduce, or maybe foreign aid would draw down, what is the international community doing to bring back the indigenous entrepreneurs who have fled the country to Pakistan or Dubai due to wrong Western policies? Thank you.
Ashley, you want to start with that?
I didn't quite hear the entire question.
Oh, okay.
So if you wouldn't mind just quickly summarizing.
Sure, or why don't we go to London here? Why don't you guys respond to that, and then I'll come back to Ashley.
Okay. Essentially, what is the international community doing to invigorate host nation contractors rather than the new crop of exploitative businesses?
No, the question was, I mean, Afghanistan always had indigenous entrepreneur ever since it was a transit hub at the center of the Silk Route. And these indigenous entrepreneurs stayed there during the Soviet occupation. They stayed there during the Civil War. For the first time in the history of Afghanistan, foreign aid and the use of foreign aid as a weapon system or military tool resulted in their exclusion. Yeah. Most of the Afghan entrepreneurs, the indigenous genuine entrepreneurs, have fled the country. I mean, what we are seeing today in Kabul is a very artificial economy based on contracts. I mean, contracts being given out by the US Department of Defense and other major bilateral or multilateral organizations. And we all know about the patronage capitalism over there. This patronage capitalism is not sustainable. It was not sustainable from the first day. What is the international community doing to support, to bring back the indigenous entrepreneurs who were the backbone of the Afghan economy for hundreds of years when there was no foreign aid?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, a very tough question. Thank you for giving it to me first. I think it's incredibly difficult to unpick patronage capitalism, and I think you just need to look at a few Eastern European and the odd Western European country to see the difficulties of doing that. And it's not a simple thing, because you simply can't unpick what you've done in the past. The way out of it isn't the way that you came into it. We have created new patronage networks. Those patronage networks are looking to diversify already. And I think the risk is that those patronage networks will compensate for the reduction in rents that they can obtain from international development money by seeking to obtain rents from the increase in the narcotics industry that will occur as the coalition military presence around the country reduces. We've already seen even the Taliban trying to secure territory, land, the means of production of opium. We've seen narcotics warlords trying to expand their physical presence in the Dashta, in the desert of Helmand and beyond. So I think the problem is actually a bigger one, and that is that these patronage networks are going to occupy the political space, the vacuum that's created by the reduced donor and military presence from the international community, and they're going to reinforce and diversify in new and unusual ways, and will become an even more toxic part of the Afghan political economy. I think there have been, in fairness to the international community, I think there have been efforts to try and create an environment which is conducive to investment. There have been efforts, although they've been fairly sclerotic and small, to create a tax regime, to create a system where foreign businesses can begin to operate in the more secure areas. But I think they've been very difficult. I think some of the interesting developments are going to be the expansion of Chinese presence, where the Chinese have got, they haven't generated the same toxic reaction as Western businesses and some Afghan businesses. The Chinese are far more resilient when it comes to risk as well, and we've seen with the IMAC copper investment, for example, a real willingness to try and create an environment in which Chinese industry can flourish and Chinese access to raw materials can increase as well. But the idea of creating or facilitating the rise of a new, purer form of Afghan business is going to be a tremendous challenge, and I think it's one that's beyond the international community and will have to be part of any political settlement to foster investment, to increase supervision of international investment, and to eventually create an environment for inward investment of business money.
Mm. Yeah, I think you made a good point there, and you know, which speaks to one of my own feelings, which is that, you know, the West has very much we've kind of worked with the wrong power structures, we've empowered the wrong people, and in doing so, we have alienated those people who had a more positive role to play. I think that you know, definitely trade is very, very important in bringing regional stability, because I think if there's an interest in it for Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, even some of the northern countries, to have the transit trade back, maybe sort of slightly more legitimate and so on. But I think that that is going to be the route to stability. Just we haven't also mentioned Pakistan and India. I mean, we've barely mentioned Pakistan, but not India at all. I think that we also, that has to be part of any regional settlement. And I think, you know, the Americans have been very lax on Pakistan the last 10 years. There's been far too much unconditional military aid and too much, perhaps, failure to recognize that Pakistan's strategic interests are not aligned with the West in Afghanistan, that Pakistan does seem to continue to believe that it has the right, or a legitimate right, to interfere in Afghanistan. And I think that we have to really make it clear that it does not. Pakistan has not played, has a rather bad role in Afghanistan in the last couple of decades. And but you know, the way to sort that out is going to have to be ultimately a bigger regional accord. I mean, we have to be we should have been working more on the situation with India and Kashmir. And I mean, I think, you know, that's been going on in the background, but we have to continue to try to foster ties between those two countries. Again, trade perhaps is going to be very significant, and they all have a lot to gain from that. So I hope that, you know, we work on that rather than the military approach.
And Ashley, just quickly, if you could respond to the question, and I'll expand it. So, is the West trying to facilitate local businesses, indigenous products, and also, are we headed for an economic depression in Afghanistan? Huge percentage, sometimes 90. I think the percentage you said was 75 of the GDP of all the money going through the country right now is foreign. Much of it's about to leave. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would refer people to that World Bank report, which is absolutely shocking and alarming in terms of the statistics and what they predict as economists, what's going to happen. It's an incredible bubble of war economy, but that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that there has been a really interesting growth in domestic industry, especially the media industry. The example of Tolo, which USAID has invested in. It's now sort of a media empire, which is expanding into other countries. There are other media companies that have done amazing and innovative things and had, you know, an explosion of growth and success. Whether or not that can be sustained is questionable, some elements of it, but I think you've seen a lot of investment on the media and telecommunications front, and those are all Afghan companies. You have Saki, you have Roshan, I mean, you have all of these things where it's yeah, there hasn't been enough private sector investment, but what there has been is incredibly promising, and you see growth and you see continued expansion. Of course, the cost of corruption for a lot of Afghan businesses are simply too high, and they impinge upon that growth, and I think that's where good governance comes in. It also comes in on one issue Stuart mentioned, which was extractive industries. He mentioned the INAC copper mine and the Chinese. And without going into too much detail, I think a lot of donors in the Afghan government, if you ask them what the future of Afghanistan is, they say it's the mines. But that's, you know, seeing a yield on that is at least 15 or 20 years away. It's also dependent on the agreements that the Afghan government strikes with those companies, such as those at INAC, that will exploit those mines. The agreement at INAC and other mines are incredibly disadvantageous for various reasons. One can only speculate to the Afghans, and the idea that they'll see significant profits upon which to build revenue in government is very questionable because of the terms of those agreements. So I think part of it is up to the Afghan government to be responsible and to manage its resources from here on out responsibly and in a way that will build for future growth. I think when you talk about the U.S. and other military forces reliance on contractors, but that bubble is already bursting, and you already see more and more unemployment in the South and in the East. CERC money, the money that fuels U.S. PRTs, has already dramatically declined over the past 2 years. So how to stimulate that growth? I mean, I think that's part of transition. That's part of what donors need to be looking at.
And were there any other questions here? And otherwise I'll let Stuart respond to something that Lucy said. Anybody else?
Yeah, it was really just to pick up two points. One point from both Lucy and Ashley, and that was the regional states do need to play a much more active role, and it's quite interesting seeing, for example, Iran's influence, much against the American desire, but certainly the Iranians have been exercising soft power instruments, an element of an Iranian university, a factory from Iran's biggest car producer being established in Herat, significant investments in agriculture, education, and the media as well. So I think there is potential scope there. I think it's not just Pakistan, though, that needs to think very carefully about where its strategic interests lie. It's defined everything in terms of curbing Indian power and Indian influence. But I think also Saudi Arabia, which has tremendous leverage over Pakistan, and has been very blind to the potential role that it could play in curbing elements within ISI, in creating a vision of a more stable Afghanistan, and playing a more astute role to further stability. So I think Pakistan does need to wake up and simply reconsider its strategic interests and how they're best served. But I think Saudi Arabia can play a very active role. And I think there does need to be a much greater attempt to harness some of the quite positive things, actually, that Iran is doing in terms of trying to bring a degree of stability on this issue, although I recognize it's an incredibly complex relationship it has with the United States.
Mm-hmm. And unless there are any last-minute questions, I'll go. I'll just go one last kind of lightning round. Did you want to ask one? Sure. Okay. Oh, there's two. Okay. Great. So quickly, because we're running out of time. One question right here. So quick questions, please.
Thanks. It's Ellie Nichol from Global Witness here. I have a quick comment and a question. Firstly, to come back on the point that Ashley was making about the contractual basis of the extractive industries going forward. We've just published a report on the Karazagan gold mine and the Aynak copper mine analysis looking at them, so I'd encourage you to have a look. The second question is, given the precedent set with the predatory forces in Afghanistan, what more can the international community do to try and stop those forces coming in the extractive industries? That's it.
Howard again. My question is, what do the panelists make of the interest around subnational governance reform and the push to sort of strengthen the role of provincial and district level government, both in terms of sort of any aspirations around political settlements or settlement at different levels, and then also in terms of the humanitarian side? The NGO I work for and others has worked more on a community level through supporting community development councils through the NSP program, for example, and piloted clustering those and linking them up to district level. But now there's this sort of complete sort of shift, apparently, and almost from some, there's a sort of we want to drop the support at the community level. That's not sustainable. Everything's going to be about district and provincial level. And our fear is you sort of maybe throw the baby out with the bathwater there. But clearly there's a logic around that subnational governance reform. How does that play into the transition process?
So let's do a lightning round for everyone, and everyone can have their last opportunity to speak. So subnational governance, Lucy, how does that play into helping the humanitarian space, helping protect Afghan civilians? That's what we're trying to talk about today, and what is the best way to guarantee the humanitarian space going forward? And if you do have something to say on the extractive industries and keeping people above the board there, please add to it.
I'll look out for Global Witness's report on that. Sounds very interesting. In terms of subnational governance, I presume what you're referring to is, I think that the US, I think the DOD did a report last year talking about how they were going to get out of Afghanistan, essentially, and part of that was this idea of devolving from the center to the regions. And are you saying now that there's much more focus at provincial and regional level rather than the district level, which throws things into somewhat of a difficulty? Because I think a lot of the NSP has been, it's been very important that it's been very much carried out at the district level, and that it's grassroots and upwardly. I think that has to be handled with a great deal of care. And again, you know, with this rush for the exit, this idea that we can do these quick fixes, this is the antithesis to what needs to be done in Afghanistan. Things have to be, we have to take the long-term perspective. And when it comes to moving from, I mean, there's obviously been a great need to move from center to regions, but I think what you're saying is very worrying. And that this has to be slowed up. And, you know, we're not going to deliver stability in a few months or days or even years. That this is going to take time. In relation to the political settlement, you talked about that. Are you're just talking generally about stability at the sort of district level, or you're talking about talks?
The theory is that by strengthening the role of provincial or district government structures, that may engineer sort of bringing factions together within those structures. That and there's a sort of, you can see a logic around that, but in the current context.
I'd also heard recently that Karzai's very much still doing his horse trading and trying to control who gets in those positions. So again, it's him sort of trying to keep that control, and he has to learn not to do that and to trust the process a little more. And again, just to mention this shura that I was very interested in, I wrote about in my book, from Nangarhar, that they had managed to, I mean, they obviously it was very much district level and localized, but they had managed to also make ties with on the regional and provincial and even with other provinces. So that, you know, that's also something that just doesn't need to be completely dismissed, but is perhaps not what the international community is working with. Good question.
And we'll go over to Stuart now. Subnational governance, does that play a part in some of the solutions in terms of guaranteeing humanitarian space, protecting Afghan civilians? What is the best way to guarantee that space and protect Afghans going forward?
I think it does. Afghanistan is obviously one of the most centralized states, at least in terms of appointments. Most of them will go through district governors, and provincial governors will all go through Karzai. And it's clear that he's hedging his bets for the period after the presidential elections and to maintain his patronage network once he's no longer in the palace in Kabul. But the idea of a bottom-up piece is a sensible one in lots of ways. When you look at many of the motivations that lead people to violence, a lot of them are based on local conflict over access to water, land, tribal disputes, etc. So the idea that you can create a block to some of those grievances is sensible. But the problem is the international community's whole policy is almost one of up and out. It's focusing less at the district level, more at the provincial level, and then increasingly at the level of the capital, and then leaving, which gives them even less leverage over the appointments of some of these malign actors. And I think that's very, very dangerous. I think it's also interesting that when you talk to some quite senior diplomats in Kabul and in capitals, they talk about not backing winners and losers. It's got to be an Afghan process, which is code for not meddling in something that you've got a track record of really being quite dismal at. But also it's code for, well, let's let some of the noxious forces back into power as well, because we would struggle to stop them. And to be honest, it might be convenient for us as well. So I think there is a real danger that this up and out strategy reduces oversight of some of the district level appointments, which are key to maintaining at least some of the political settlements which are possible at a district and provincial level. So I think it's a very dangerous process.
And Ashley, we'll let you have the last word. Going forward, what's the best way to protect the humanitarian space in Afghanistan, and the best way to protect Afghan civilians?
That's not a tough question. I guess, I mean, a lot of it, I think, is recognizing and pressuring donors and NATO contributing countries to ISAF to actually not rush for the exit, to actually, you have to recognize that there is zero political will left. I mean, that is a fact in terms of any more progress or strengthening structures. I mean, subnational governance, people aren't having these discussions really anymore, and if they are, they're having them as Howard relayed in a sort of schizophrenic way. Oh, it's not about the community, it's about the district and the provincial. Well, actually, it's about all of them, isn't it? And that's common sense. So I think right now it's really about articulating the agenda for the future and trying to make sure that in these processes there are Afghans involved, that it isn't, again, driven by donor interest and a donor rush for the door and domestic political concerns. I think the real concern for me being here right now is that there's, troops are leaving and there's no political process, there are no political talks, there's no political dialogue. Each contingent, whether it's the Taliban, if you can even say that's a unified contingent, is more and more fractured. If you're looking at ISAF, they're all looking for the door in their own individual, uncoordinated way. Or if you're looking at the Afghan government, there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of divisiveness at the national level as well as the subnational level. You see governors like Shirzai and like Atta and like these old names, these power holders positioning themselves for transition, and everyone is going in their own direction. And civilians are increasingly left alone, they're left feeling insecure, and are planning their own exit strategies if they're lucky enough. And I think that's what Dr. Samar hinted at the beginning. It's this, Afghans don't know. They don't know that there's, they don't know what the future holds. There's no concrete plan. And I think the more that can be done to empower positive Afghan voices, activists, and members of government who really are connected to the populations they are meant to represent, the more that can be done to articulate the concerns and needs of Afghans to those who will determine the country's future, which sadly are Western powers, better off will be. But right now it's incredibly dire, and if it continues down this path, I think there's significant reason to worry about the future of Afghanistan, about the worst case options and the scenarios we heard today, civil war and so on. I mean, I like to be optimistic, but I think there's an urgent need to pressure governments to really articulate the humanitarian agenda and to hold them responsible for what they've created and what their obligations are to this country and to its people.
Well, a realistic sense, a lot of worry, but a little hope. Just note Ashley's note of hope, and it's not too late to change. So thank you for the panelists, Dr. Seema Samar, Ashley Jackson, Lucy Morgan-Edwards, Dr. Stuart Gordon. Thank you for all of you. Yeah, have a good day. And obviously, these guys are around to answer any and all of your questions that you may not have asked. So thank you very much.